Good morning, kids and everyone else. I am so glad you're here today for another story from God's Word, the Bible, which is absolutely true and completely trustworthy. And when we choose to know and love God, the one true God who made the heavens and earth, we call him capital G God, then we do want to please him and do what he says. Well, the Jews who had once lived in Judah have been taken captive, and they are now living over here in Babylon, far away from what they thought was home. And we have been following the lives of 4 of the young men who were taken: Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And with God's power and help, they have been protected and they have been promoted into wonderful positions of leadership in that country. Our story today comes from Daniel chapter 3, and I invite you to turn there now and follow along. King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king of Babylon, had made a very large statue, and he set it out on the plain of Dura, outside the city there. This statue, to give you an idea, was as wide as one of the pews that you're sitting in, and it was as tall as 3 of these buildings stacked upon one another. It was huge. And he determined that he would have a very special ceremony to dedicate this. And he called all the people of Babylon to come and gather on this plain and be a part of this ceremony. And when all the people had gathered, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but not Daniel. Daniel's name is not in this story. Then a herald, a man with a really loud voice, stood before all of the people, and he said, "People, when you hear the music play, then you are to bow down and worship this image that King Nebuchadnezzar has made. And if you choose not to, then we're going to throw you into the fiery furnace. And basically, you will die." Well, the music played, and the people bowed down, all except for 3 young men. They stood standing, and there were some other men there, some other officials who noticed that those 3 young men did not bow down. And they went to King Nebuchadnezzar and they said, "Oh, king, do you know that when the music played, there were 3 young men, 3 Jews, in fact, who did not bow down and worship the image like you had said?" And this made King Nebuchadnezzar really angry. So he called Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to come before him. And basically, he gave them a second chance. He said, "Did you hear that when the music plays, you're supposed to bow down and worship the image? Do you want to try again?" And they played the music again. Of course, they did not bow down. King Nebuchadnezzar said, "If you do not worship, then you will be thrown into the fiery furnace, and who can rescue you from my hand?" The 3 young men said back to King Nebuchadnezzar, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves in front of you. If we are thrown into that blazing furnace, our God, the God we serve, is able to deliver us from your hand." Don't you love that? And he will. But even if he chooses not to, that is okay, because we are not going to bow down and worship any other gods other than the capital G God. Well, this made King Nebuchadnezzar even more mad, because he thought he was the greatest. He ruled a very large kingdom, and everybody thought he was wonderful. So he ordered that the fire be made 7 times hotter in this furnace. That meant that it would immediately kill a person who was put in there. So he called his strongest soldiers, and those soldiers were to bind up the hands of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they went to throw them in, clothes and all, which is not how they usually did things. And when the soldier went to throw them in, he fell down dead. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into this, and they were standing up and walking around. And the king looked over and jumped out of his seat and went as close as he could get to see what was going on. And he said, "Didn't we throw 3 men in there? Because I see 4. And that 4th one looks like a son of God." And that was Jesus before Jesus had come to earth. He was in that fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Nebuchadnezzar called them to come out. And he called them servants of the Most High God. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of that fire. And do you know they did not smell of smoke? Their hands were not bound. Their clothes were not dirty. There was nothing to say that they had been in or even near a fire. If you've ever gone to the beach and done a bonfire, or maybe out in the woods you had a campfire, you know that you smell like a fire when you're done and you only sat around it. And yet there was nothing that let them think that they had been in a fire. Nebuchadnezzar then said these words. He said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, and even though they defied my words and were willing to give up their lives to worship him, their God has cared for them." And then he said that nobody in the kingdom of Babylon could say a bad word about their God, because their God was more powerful than any other. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were given even higher ranks in the country of Babylon to help lead it and guide it. You know, these 3 young men have been given several tests while they've been in Babylon. If you remember back to Daniel chapter 1, the first one was, what are you going to eat? When they chose not to eat the food of the idols. And today their test was, who will they worship? And they chose to worship the capital G God, not all the little g gods of the land. And God honored that. We have seen through all of our Bible stories that God has kept his covenant, the promise that he first made to Abraham to make him a great nation, to give him the original land of Israel or Canaan. He gave his people good laws through the 10 Commandments. And one of those laws was, you will not have any other gods before me. No little g gods should take the place of God. Because God is holy and perfect. And he does not want us to sin, to do things that are wrong in the way that we think or do or say. But he does offer us the opportunity to be forgiven if only we ask. And he will help us to be devoted fans of God who love him with all of our heart and our soul and our strength, just as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego showed us in this story today. You know, we have those same choices. And maybe there's some things that get in the way of you and God, something that you think is maybe more important. I hope that you will make that same choice to worship only the capital G God.